All right, yeah. So let's go ahead and just start. If people are still joining, that's fine, and we can start with a few minutes of just breathing meditation to settle our minds and come into the present moment, settle extraneous discursive thoughts. And then while we're still in a meditative mode, let's just take a few minutes to cultivate a motivation for this class and for this day, particularly a motivation, of loving kindness and compassion and great compassion and bodhicitta, right? was to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of others. So it should take a few minutes to kind of cultivate that kind of motivation for our day, reminding ourselves of the purpose of our lives. Like that. So then with bodhicitta in our minds and hearts, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. You see everybody. Oh, I think I'm supposed to tag. You can do whatever view, but I guess for the recording, it's pin. I'm going to pin myself, but then do whichever view works for you. There, just the recording part. So in the so we've been covering, obviously mind and mental factors. For those who are following the text, we're at the bottom of page 67. But I just thought to orient us for a second. And actually, I was thinking, in reference to compassion, right? Because we've been studying mind and mental factors, right? And so there's, we started with the main mind, right, which is just awareness. And then as we've been kind of studying, that main mind is accompanied by various mental factors, right, in each moment. And some mental factors are, as we said, omnipresent, they're always there, and other mental factors come and go. And now we're just, so we finished the 6 root mental afflictions. And now we're up to the secondary mental afflictions. I just want to remind us, myself, I guess, all of us, that the mental afflictions particularly are connected to compassion, aren't they? Because, the basic tenet of Buddhist psychology, right, from the Four Noble Truths on, so from the earliest teaching of the Buddha, is that it's the mental afflictions, the kleshas, right, mental afflictions, that are the cause of suffering. Right? And so if we want to practice, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, so if you want to practice compassion, you have to, if you want to practice compassion for yourself, then you have to work with your own mental afflictions, right? And then if we want to engage compassionately with others, we have to understand, suffering and its causes, right? So they're the mental afflictions. So, so this topic of the mental afflictions, one point is that, it's directly connected to compassion in the sense of understanding that, first of all, they're in the nature of suffering, and secondly, they're the cause of our own and others' suffering. So that's why we're studying them. And then particularly we study them as tools for introspection, right? Because actually, we always say it, right? In Buddhism, in Buddhist training, the idea isn't that you go around and like, what's the word? Saying to other people, oh, the next one, the first of the secondary mental afflictions is belligerent. So the purpose of studying is obviously not to go around saying to other people, oh, you're a very belligerent person. That's not helpful, is it? The purpose is to recognize our own, when belligerence arises in our own mind, right? And to work with it. And if we work with that, we're actually one thing is we're decreasing our own suffering, but also if we decrease our belligerence, we're leaving others of the suffering of having to deal with us. So that's quite good. So we're working with the mental afflictions. As soon as you work with the mental afflictions, the idea is that one point is, mainly working with our own mental afflictions is self-compassion, in the sense that it's eliminating the cause of our own suffering. But actually, what His Holiness Dalai Lama often talks about inner disarmament, right? That outer disarmament in the world depends upon people getting rid of our own hatred, actually, right? As long as we're hateful, the world won't be a safe place. And so, and he points out that, it'd be sort of hypocritical and impossible, right? If we're filled with hatred, we're not going to help others eliminate their hatred. Khensa Rinpoche often said that. He said, if you want to help, how did he say it? He said, like, basically, if you want to make the world a better place, and also if you want to help others get themselves under control, the best method is to be loving, right? Is to enter into a relationship with an attitude of love, of loving kindness. But we can't do that if the mental afflictions are present. That's one thing we've studied, right? The mind has if the mind has loving kindness, then it doesn't, in that moment, it doesn't have a mental affliction. Does that make sense? It has a virtuous mental factor. So they don't coexist in the same moment. They do coexist in the same people, of course. We all of us have loving kindness. We all have mental afflictions. But to the extent to which we decrease our mental afflictions, to that extent, we have more room for love and compassion in our minds. So, so my point is just that whether we want to help ourselves be relieved from suffering, or we want to help others be relieved from suffering, or both, we have to work with our mental afflictions first. And if we understand our own mental afflictions, then it'll be much easier to help others. So that's the reason we're studying these, just sort of reorienting ourselves. And then we're up to this section, which is teaching on the secondary mental afflictions, 20 of them, right? And again, in the teachings, they say there are limitless secondary, there are limitless mental afflictions, but these 20 are common ones, and so they're taught as means for introspection. And, then we can have variation, you can sort of see different variations of how different mental afflictions can happen in our minds. But the idea is if you understand the 6 root mental afflictions and 20 secondary mental afflictions, that's like a guideline. I said this early on in this series of classes, that it's almost like a roadmap. Like, so if you're traveling somewhere and you have a map, or kind of an idea of where you're going, especially if you're going to a foreign country, let's say, right? You want to like orient yourself. Oh, what's near what? Someplace you're not familiar with. And I guess that's a map is a good analogy, because a map doesn't show you every single thing, right, that exists in a place, but it's enough to get around. It's enough to orient you. So that's what these are. They're like a map of your mind, actually. All the mind and mental factors. It's like a map of your mind in order to orient you so that you become good at understanding your mind, at introspecting, at sort of understanding what's happening inside of you so that you can work with it, right? And the idea in Buddhism, of course, is that if you understand the mental afflictions, then you can identify them when they arise, and you can also then apply, there are all kinds of antidotes actually taught in Buddhism, right? Temporary antidotes and ultimate antidotes and so on. But if you don't know you're having a mental affliction, or if you identify with mental affliction and think it's not a mental affliction, it's a good thing, then you won't work with it, will you? And then you can't begin. So we have to understand, so we have to be able to understand what they are in order to look at our own minds and then work with our mind, is the idea. So first, the author just lists the 20 mental afflictions. I'm not going to read that because we're going to go over them one by one. So there's no point in just reading the names, because we'll start by going over them. And one thing I want to note, though, also is that each mental affliction, when they say secondary, because that means they're secondary to the root mental afflictions. And so as we go through them, the author notes, if some mental afflictions are secondary to hatred, some are secondary to craving or attachment, desire, or whatever. Some is secondary to ignorance, and some are secondary to a combination of both, of two different mental afflictions. And that just means they can either be like elaborations on them, the first one is an elaboration on anger or hatred, belligerence, right? It's a particular version of anger that kind of is an elaboration of that. So they're secondary in the sense that they're like further elaborations or further specifications of root mental afflictions. Okay, so we'll just go through them and then we'll pause and discuss them. So the first one here is translated as belligerence, which I think is probably a good translation. Art Engel translated this one as anger because he translated the one that sometimes translates as anger as hatred. So anyway, there are different translators use different terms, but first we'll read what the author says and then elaborate. So the author here says, regarding belligerence, and then he quotes the Abhidharma, the Compendium of Knowledge. He says, what is belligerence? And he says, it is a malice, right? So malice meaning wish to harm, right? When the cause of harm abides nearby and it is involved with anger, right? So it's secondary to anger. It's a kind of anger. It has the function of acting as a support for taking up weapons, punishing, and so forth, and preparing to injure others. So first thing you get is here, it's like, there are many, what they're getting at here is there are many different kinds of, I'll say, anger. And belligerence, it says here, first of all, the cause of harm abides nearby. So what they're getting at, and then also it says here, it acts as a support for taking up weapons, punishing, and so forth. Those are examples, but what it's getting at is like, there's first of all, there are all kinds of anger, right? And sometimes we're angry when somebody, let's say a person, I'm use that as an example. The person we're angry at is far away, right? We can sit around ruminating for hours if we want to about, they did this and they did that, and so on. This is not like that. Belligerence is where the person, or let me use an example of a person. It could also be an object, or it could be an animal. It could be a thing. We can get angry at the weather, for example, or something, or noise. But in this case, I'm going to use the example of a person. So the person is nearby, and it's like you lose your temper. Does that make sense? So belligerence is where, malice, it's a malice where you lose your temper and you want to strike out. So if it's like, actually, sometimes people have that with an example, like a computer, right? Where they throw, or their phone, the phone's not working, they throw their phone against the wall or something. That would be an example, right? It's like, so it's in the moment, the thing is nearby, and you either act, it's a mental state where you want to strike out or you want to harm, and in particular physically. So you can either want to harm or you can actually act out. And and if you anyway, yeah. So I'll keep going, and then I'll keep going in the text, and I'll elaborate a little more. So Geshe Rabtin, in his commentary, he says, due to an increase of anger, it is a thoroughly malicious state of mind wishing to cause immediate harm. So that's it. That's the part here. So it says nearby or immediate, right? So it's a state of mind where it's like losing your temper or something. It's like where you want to strike out, or you want to what's the word? You want to cause harm in that moment. It's not just kind of a mental. So it's a mental state where that's what you want. Does that make sense? That the impulse is really to kind of strike out or to do something physically to hurt the other person or object. And in Vasubandhu's text, I'll just a similar point, but I'll just it's connected to anger or hatred, and he calls it an animosity, malice or animosity. So an animosity of mind towards a source of harm that is actually present. Does that make sense? So it's not something distant. It's where the source of harm and source of harm means what you're labeling a source of harm, right? Like, so for example, if it's your phone, if you feel like your phone's harming you, right, because it's not working the way you want, and then you throw it. So it's not that, it doesn't mean the object of your anger or malice or belligerence is actually trying to harm you, but you're perceiving it that way. Sometimes could be trying to harm you if it's a person that's being belligerent to you as well, for example. But it's that kind of mind. And then it says, anyway, this is the same as in the section on anger. It says, the object, there are 9 bases of malice, and it goes through them, right? So it's thinking if it's a person, you feel that person is harming you, has harmed you, or will harm you. Or same thing, they either have harmed, are harming, or will harm your friend, or that they have benefited, are benefiting, or will benefit your enemy, right? And so that's your mental state. Does that make sense? Like, so, that you see the person and you feel they sided with my enemy, and then but it's always in the present moment that you have this belligerence, right? So you think, oh, there's that person, they helped my enemy, and then there's this wish to kind of throw something at them or whatever, or harm them. That's belligerence. And you can get the feeling, I mean, I was thinking about this. I was like, I was going to say, if you listen to these descriptions, the idea is to relate them back and go, oh, okay, that's when I felt that, and there was like, I've had this kind of mental state, whether you've actually acted out on it and hit somebody, or whether you've just had the feeling, it's a mental state, right? It's not the physical action that's belligerence. And actually, I was sort of laughing last night as I was thinking about the 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions. And then I thought, for us who are like samsaric beings, these are our biography, actually. Like, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have an outer biography, inner, and secret. The outer is like the deeds you did. The inner is like what happened in your mind in your life, like a psychological biography, right? It would be, I guess, in American culture, we call it a psychological biography. They call it inner biography. So I was thinking, oh, wow, for an ordinary person, actually, the mental afflictions would be our inner biography. So you go, oh, which ones do I have the most of, and so on, and when. Anyway, so that's that's what belligerence is, right? So it's this state where in the moment the object of your anger is present, and you want to strike out. You want to actually that's why they say malice or animosity, right? It's this kind of overwhelming feeling. And then the author, Geshe Gyaltsen, says, he brings up anger, the root mental affliction, versus belligerence, right? Because this is the first of the secondary mental afflictions, so he's trying to differentiate. So he says here, since anger occurs in the context of the root mental afflictions and belligerence in the context of the secondary afflictions, what's the difference between them, right? He asks the question. And then he says, perhaps anger is an intolerant, malicious mind occurring when the 3 objects dawn as objects of observation, whereas belligerence is an extremely disturbed mind, which upon great intensifying of anger wishes to strike physically when the cause of anger abides nearby. So you get the idea here. And at one point I want to make with this is, you can actually, if you look at yourself or you look at people right, you can see this, right? Somebody could be harboring a kind of anger, right? And then they see the person, right? and there's like a danger of violence, isn't there? It could be like that. And so this is a more, as he says here, a great intensifying of anger, right? It's an extreme kind of anger where the person is overwhelmed by their anger. And one point I want to make too is like, actually, I just want to elaborate for a second on this because it's an important point. Like, let me see this the right way. Let's bring this up, and I think it's an important psychological point. Is any mental factor, right? Whether they're virtuous mental factors or they're afflicted mental factors, if you let your mind become very familiar with it, it'll become easy to give rise to it. Does that make sense? So I'm going to use the example of love for a second. If you cultivate love over and over, loving kindness over and over and over, your mind becomes very familiar with love, right? And then and then your love becomes more intense, actually, right? It becomes more overwhelming. It becomes easier to give rise to. The slightest provocation can give rise to love then. And your love becomes kind of something very powerful. Whereas if you don't often give rise to love, then your love will be kind of brief and not very strong. And so the same thing applies to anger. Does that make sense? And the problem is that love takes a lot of effort to cultivate. If we want to cultivate loving kindness for all beings, including our enemies, that takes effort, right? Unfortunately, anger doesn't take much effort, right? It's easy to give rise to anger if you let yourself. And the point I want to make is if you let yourself familiarize your mind with anger, then anger will come more easily. And then eventually anger will become belligerence, right? Whereas if you cultivate anger enough when you're alone, then eventually it will become this kind of overwhelming, intense wish to harm. And then you'll strike out. And one point, I always think of this, like that Lama Zopa Rinpoche makes, is he sometimes he'll say, you may think there's no harm, I'm just alone, cultivating anger. But he makes this point, he says, over lifetimes, if you do that, then your mind becomes more and more familiar with anger and becomes hatred and becomes belligerent. And then eventually you will harm others. Does that make sense? It'll become, because that's the nature of anger. It's a wish to harm. And if you let anger cultivate enough, it will become, as it says here, in a greatly intense form. And actually, as I'm talking, I mean, there are so many examples of that in the world, but in America, there are all these shootings, right? That's what's that, right? There's a person who alone cultivated hatred, right? And then it became so intense that they put themselves in the air and then got overwhelmed by it and planned it out, whatever. But you get my point. But there are countless examples, and so of how anger leads to belligerence, which leads to actually harming others. And the point is that the point of all that is this point of inner disarmament, is recognize, this is what Buddhism is saying, is that anger and belligerence are dangerous actually to yourself and dangerous to others. So identify them quickly. And, it's good. And one point is, to not act out on your belligerent, the first step sometimes may just be you feel belligerence, but you don't actually hit somebody. Well, that's progress compared to actually hitting them. But in Buddhist practice, the idea is you actually work with the belligerence itself. Does that make sense? And what's the main antidote to anger and all the anger associated mental factors? Love, right? Patience is also, there are different, Shantideva's text on patience is wonderful, so you can study that. As an antidote to anger, he teaches many methods there for decreasing our anger. But if anger is a malice wishing to harm others, its direct opposite is love, right? Which is the wish that others be happy. So if we cultivate love, that's a way of decreasing our anger. If you cultivate love for your enemies, then that's the supreme method for overcoming anger and belligerence. But anyway, you get the idea here. So belligerence is this particular version of anger where the object is nearby and it becomes incredibly intense. Right. And especially that happens, doesn't it? Where if you have an underlying anger at somebody and then you see them, then it can flare up. That's one way of saying it, right? And that can be like this belligerence. And then he just makes a couple more points here. I actually don't think it is. He's just getting at some details, which I actually don't think are that important to cover for us, for our purposes. He's getting at just, again, more details about the difference between anger and belligerence, but it's making the same point we already made. I think he explained his view already on what the difference is between those two, so I'll leave it there. But then we're going to keep going with the next one. Actually, I'll go one more and then I'll pause and see if people have questions. This one's brief. This one's brief, and then another version of anger, another expression of anger, secondary mental afflictions related to anger, is resentment, which other translators have translated this one as vengeance or a grudge. So resentment, vengeance, a grudge. And I'll do the same thing. This is very brief, so I'll just cover it quickly. But in the Compendium of Knowledge, Yabi Dharma, it says, what is resentment? And it says, it is a refusal to let go of thoughts of harm following that, i.e. belligerence, and is involved with anger. It has the function of acting as support for intolerance. In Geshe Rabten, I thought he had a nice phrase. He said, he says, resentment or vengeance is like a knot inside your own mind. There's a famous quote I always liked from the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I always thought it reminded me, when I read it, I thought, it reminds me of my own experience, where it said something like, foolish people create knots in space, or make knots out of space, right? It's kind of funny, isn't it? Because you can't tie space into a knot, right? But it's making this point that we make things up. We make up things that don't exist, and then we tie them in knots, and then we live our life tied in a knot. Does that make sense? And it's saying, if you recognize that it's just space, then you don't even have to untie the knot. You can just relax. It's the idea. That's like this, right? So resentment is a knot in your own mind where you have a thought, right, that somebody harmed you, or something harmed you, that something was bad, is exaggerated. And then you ruminate on it and you refuse to let it go, right? You keep coming back and you think, how could they have done, so you have this thought, oh, this person harmed me. How could they have harmed me? How could they have done that? They're terrible. Oh my goodness. And you go over it and over, right? I'm so upset with them. I'm so disappointed in them. They're so bad. They're so that. And so you, so you hold on to it over time. So that's the unique factor of this one, of vengeance or resentment, is where you hold on to it. So it arises in the wake of an initial experience, a moment of anger, but here you don't let it stay a moment. You keep bringing it back up. And then it says, just as has been said above, it is a mind refusing to let go of a continuum of anger and wishes to harm or retaliate. It's simply to be understood that resentment acts as support for intolerance. And then it says, and one commentary translated that as impatience, right? An unwillingness to tolerate the wrong that it was done to you or yours, and a desire to do something harmful in return. And then I want to make a few more points here. One is, so then it says, in regard to these two mental factors, the precious Garland, or Nagarjuna, says, belligerence is a disturbance of the mind, tagging along behind that is resentment. So sometimes you can have belligerence and then it becomes a resentment, right? If you don't let it go after the person's no longer present. But a few points I want to make. One is, this idea of holding on to anger, that's what this is getting at, right? So holding a grudge, or holding a mind of vengeance, or holding a mind of resentment, its main function is that it causes you suffering, isn't it? So in other words, it's like if you spend your time thinking back over and over again about somebody who harmed you and how you think they harmed you, the main effect of doing that is that it makes you miserable in the short run. Another main effect of that is it habituates you to anger, which makes you miserable in the long run. Then it makes you more likely to have more conflict with that person. If you see them, you'll be unpleasant, and so it also creates interpersonal misery. So it's the function of, actually, it's interesting, if you think about resentment or vengeance or holding on to anger, its main effect obviously is misery, right? And so that's where it's like this knot in your mind, that you're holding on to, that's kind of making you uptight, making you stressed, making you unhappy, and so on. And then this phrase I just thought is interesting, where it says, acting as a support for intolerance or impatience. it's this idea, it's getting an idea that comes up again in these secondary mental afflictions. So I just wanted to, I guess, at least mention it. Is it's interesting if you think about this word intolerance in this context, because what it's getting at in a way is, so you say right, that it's actually a lack of flexibility, a lack of resilience, a lack of peace of mind. It's an inability to tolerate what is, right? In other words, from a Buddhist perspective, if you have a negative experience, the ultimate cause of that is your own karma, right? That's the ultimate cause of your own negative experience. So in the Buddhist context here, what they're getting at is you have a negative experience, right? Which is mainly produced, well, actually, it's produced by numerous things. One is, like, actually, I was just thinking of an example. Just yesterday, I was talking to a dear friend of mine who's going through treatment for cancer, actually. And he was saying, like, he had, it's painful and very difficult, and then, like, sometimes he was telling me a story where, like, a medical professional had made a mistake and he had gotten angry. And then he realized, he was like, oh, wait a second. And he was Buddhist practitioner and he was doing this. He was like, wait a second, I'm Buddhist, and then he was saying, and if I have a body, part of it is, if you have a body, you're going to get sick. It's the nature of being human, right? And then he said, well, this person was actually, the medical professionals are doing their best. They're trying and they're human. And of course they make mistakes, and then the point is like, sometimes we can't tolerate, like he was like, I need to develop the ability to tolerate humanness, actually, right? Being human. And he did a great job with it. He became patient. He kind of thought through it and realized that what his point was, if he had held on to that anger, it would have been a knot in his mind causing him more suffering. He has enough suffering already. It was part of the point. So the point here is, like, this idea of tolerance. What this is getting at is tolerating that suffering is going to come, that difficult experiences are going to come, that people are going to misunderstand you, that you're going to have physical pain or mental pain or whatever. Things are going to happen. And part of this is, like, if we cultivate anger, and actually, if you think about somebody who's very angry, actually, it's true, right? They can't tolerate anything. If you habituate your mind to a lot of anger, then the slightest thing, right? Like, I'm sure probably you've known people like that, where, like, if you get habituated to anger, you can't tolerate reality, right? Like, you've seen people like that, where, like, somebody brings the food at a restaurant and it's a little too cold or a little too hot, they become incredibly angry, right? Or if the waiter or waitress brought the wrong dish, and they become very angry or something. Like, that's not a real suffering, even, is it? And then I see other people, like, think of that, like, other people are the opposite, right? Where they're very patient. So the point here is that what it's getting at, I just thought this phrase, right? I think this phrase has a lot of meaning to it in terms of understanding the mind. So I'm going to read again. It is simply to be understood that resentment acts as support for intolerance. So the idea is, if you allow your mind to cultivate resentment, right, to ruminate on hurts or anger, you will let yourself become somebody who's intolerant of reality, actually, is the idea. Does that make sense? And if you're intolerant of reality, then you're going to become more and more angry, right? And so it's odd, isn't it? Like, if you think about it, actually, when you read a text like this, I just think it's strange in a way, right? Because we all have sometimes resentment, right? We all can feel that. And what we don't do is we don't look at it and go, wait a second, what in the world am I doing? Like, in other words, what Buddhism is saying is, like, you have a precious human life and you have a mind, right? And you can do anything with your mind. You have some control over it. And of all the things you could do, right? It's, like, kind of funny. I mean, I've done it, so I'm not saying but, like, of all the things I could do with my mind, I'm going to spend time thinking back. And of all the things I could think about and the universe, right? I'm going to spend time thinking back about some time when I think somebody hurt me, in order to then feel I can't tolerate that and become, like, what a stupid way to spend our time. In other words, it's, like, insane, actually, way to spend your time, isn't it? To go back over something like that. Yeah. So anyway, you get the idea. So what it's saying is that, right? It's saying, and then and this, I just think so. Keep in mind, I just want to suggest, keep in mind this idea of intolerance, right? In this case, and in a right, impatience or intolerance, and that there's this idea of like that you cultivate a mind that's not tolerant of actual experience, right? And what Buddhism is suggesting is that what we want to actually cultivate is a mind that can tolerate what arises. You know, that can tolerate reality, actually, right? And then can see things realistically also. So anyway, you get the idea of resentment. Maybe I'll pause there because those are the first two of the secondary mental afflictions, and they're both connected to anger. The next one isn't connected to anger. So I'll pause there. There are more that are coming related to anger, but they, they're in a particular order. So it's not they're not all the anger and then all the attachment. So they're mixed together. Any questions or comments before I go on? Lynn?
I don't know, I see things in a political way, but I think this is a perfect description of fascism in this country, because it's people that have resentment, class resentment, for legitimate reasons. Bad things have happened to them in terms of globalization and being left out of the economy. But it turns into this intolerance, what you were saying, this intolerance of what happened. It's like the big lie about the election. It's like this intolerance of reality that brings them into more pain. I mean, it's really a good description of sort of mass resentment on a mass level in this country.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for it, but the reaction is not helping them.
Yeah, well, and you can see how just one small point I'll make. I agree with what you said, makes sense. And one small thing that strikes me is you can also see like it's just interesting, isn't it? Like the same phenomenon, right? Like say some kind of painful experience. I mean, one can react to it with resentment, or one can react, and you can see real examples where one can also react to it with love, right? Like, and it's literally true, isn't it? That the exact same phenomenon, can be reacted to in different ways, and the result, and as you're getting at, and the result will be very different then on an individual level, but also on a group level, like, and on a societal level and so on. Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I think that's true, isn't it? Is that so as individuals and also as groups and also as societies, yeah, that we can react to the same phenomenon with resentment or with love or with compassion or with, and that makes all the difference, because we can't control what happened. It's already happened, but we can control to some extent how we react to what happened, and if we as we're saying, if we cultivate resentment versus, say, compassion, it makes a world of difference.
And then the resentment sort of leads to a distortion of reality. A distortion of, well, I don't know how you define reality, but it leads to a distortion of things that most people would agree on, so that you become more distorted and more resentful. It sort of feeds on itself.
Yeah, well, at one point I'll make, I mean, we said this under anger itself, but it's all the mental afflictions connected to anger are the same as anger in the way that it's the very nature of anger to distort. That's one of the points in Buddhist psychology, is that anger always, by its very nature, exaggerates the negative qualities of the object it's angry at. So if we cultivate or if caught up in or controlled by an angry mind, that's one thing that that's one point that Buddhist psychology always makes, actually, is that anger always distorts in a negative direction the object of its anger, and so you can't see the other realistically. And Dalai Lama often points this out. He says that's why anger, on a societal, I mean, on an individual level, but also on a societal and a socio-political level, say right, the long-term results are not good, when people act out of anger because they're not seeing it realistic, they're not seeing the situation realistically. He makes that point often. So people act out thinking, oh, I'm angry at this person, so I'll make things better by acting out against them, and not seeing the long-term implications of, because anger denies how we're interconnected with others and how others' well-being is connected to our well-being. It doesn't look at that, so anyway, so anger always distorts by its very nature. And the more angry we are, the more, I think this is Buddhist psychology, isn't, well, it's applied, I think, is that the more extreme our anger, the more we distort in a way, right? If you think of the example of belligerence, right, where, it's actually funny, like with belligerence, actually, right, where the one feels, if I could just strike out and punch this person or throw something at them, I'll feel better. I'll be better. Life will be better. The world will be better. That's extremely distorted, right? An incredibly distorted state of mind, and that's an extreme of anger, right? Like, the extreme of anger and hatred, like, genocidal hatred is an example of the extreme of anger, right? Where a group of people feel the world will be a better place if we can completely eliminate this other group of people from the planet. That never works out for the best, does it? Like, so the point is anger is always distorted. Oh, Frank, you have your hand.
Yeah, thanks. So how would we straddle the difference between belligerence and revenge versus, like, if in the case of a criminal act where bringing someone to justice for an act that they did, how would you present the differences between those two things?
One thing I'll say is, like, so actually, a couple of thoughts. One is, actually, we have Sujata's an expert on this topic to some extent, I believe. I think a world-renowned expert, but so she might have more to say than me. But one from a Buddhist perspective, one quick observation is, one quick, I guess. Oh, great. We're lucky to have. But one quick, I'll only say one observation from a Buddhist perspective is that belligerence or resentment are mental states, right? Whereas, the phrase you bring somebody to justice or something I'm not sure if that's a mental state or is that a behavior. I'm not sure if that's a behavior. Like, I guess one would have to start by asking, what is that? Like, is that a mental state or is that a behavioral action? And what Sujata would have more to say about what is justice, I'm not sure, but I guess I would just say that that's one Buddhist point, is that what this is getting at is the mental state, right? So what's the mental state of the person? And that's different than the behavior, I think. So that's one point. But Sujata, you said you'd be willing to weigh in, so you know more than I do about this topic.
Yeah, happy to. So His Holiness so one of the things I think it's important to remember is that sometimes strong action needs to be taken, right? And Lauren is touching on this. In order to stop people from causing harm. When you think about even one of the Bodhisattva vows is one of the 18 vows is to it says I don't know how it's properly translated, but it smells like, or if I remember, punish people when necessary, even, strongly or physically. But the motivation, right, of somebody who's acting from a Bodhisattva place is obviously one that is about, every fiber of my being when I'm trying to stop my son from doing things he ought not to do is for his own future best interest and his current best interest. And when it is crossing over into taking something out on him, then that's anger, and that's actually not going to be corrective of his behavior, and he can surely tell the difference, right? And so the difference between individual revenge and a retributive act on the part of the state, I don't personally think that they're different. There are lots of different theories on that. If we had a perfect state, if we had a perfect state that could enact punishment without any sense of malice, right? Without any sense of, then I could see maybe there might be some value to that, but that's not how the current criminal legal system operates, right? Our prisons are quite brutal, and they are enacting punishment for the purpose of a lot of the time of just all the things that are in the list of mental afflictions. So if we could act strongly without any of the mental afflictions, then I think it could be beneficial, right? And I think there's some real misunderstanding between about the difference between accountability and punishment. And so people can be held to account out of love. And it doesn't even need to involve inflicting pain. It can be helping people fix what they did, right? So I think that's where we need some more creativity in thinking about it. But the basics in terms of like legal thinking is that when people do it individually, it's revenge. And when the state is doing it, it's some noble thing of retribution. And so I could see it potentially being noble in a state that was driven by bodhicitta. But until the state is driven by bodhicitta, then I don't think that the state should be in the business of retribution, because I spend a lot of time in prisons and with people who are incarcerated, and I can see that that's not really the way it's playing itself out, right? And it's just increasing harm, which is increasing harm, which is increasing harm. So yeah, so like what positive outcomes come from it too, I think is a really important question we have to ask, right? Like if we actually had low recidivism rates, might there be some reason to do things that felt extremely harsh sometimes? Sure. So locking people up or other types of taking away their liberties. If it was producing positive outcomes, that would be maybe something we should think about. But since it's, actually like the number one thing to cause people to go to prison is having previously gone to prison. So it's not like actually working, right? So these are some of the things that you might consider in that. But just generally speaking, what Lauren was saying is the basics of it is about our motivation. Like, why are we doing a strong action? And the vast majority of the time I see right now is it's very rare to find. I know one in this whole nation that I've ever met. There might be some more in Europe. Someone who runs a detention facility who I really think is like a secret Buddha. and everything else going on in this country is really not so great on that front. So I hope that makes sense. I'm trying not to be judgmental about it, because I'm looking in my own heart and seeing, like I try to use the example of my son in punishment, because there are times when I'm trying to rein in behavior that is coming from a place of kindness versus coming from a place of just being angry at him for having ruined my day with his whatever, being late for school or do, right? I want to help him become somebody who's timely versus just enraged that I'm late for my meeting. And I think a lot of our justice system tends to run on like, can we all just behave in a way that lets our system run, and punishing people or other sorts of things like that. So I don't know if that was more confusing or helpful.
Thanks, I found it helpful. And is it fair to say, I think is the word that Sujata works in the field of, I guess it was fair to say restorative justice. Is that the correct terminology?
Yeah, so my work is, it's shifting the questions. Instead of asking what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished, we ask who was harmed and what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. So with regard to justice, without that third question, it's just the way we should all treat each other when something goes wrong, like who is harmed and what do they need. But then when there's the obligation piece that we add, then that becomes the justice model. So people are obligated to do right by the folks that they've harmed. And then what, these community-based justice processes look like is community and families on both sides of the situation coming together to come up with a plan to repair the harm, and then supporting the person who's caused the harm to complete that plan. So that's my work. And that feels, when I call it the law's middle way, is when I usually am thinking about a second book, which is going to be called The Law's Middle Way. And it's looking at these sorts of things as a possible way forward from the disaster that's mass criminalization in the US. We think that there's a lot there. There's a lot in Nagarjuna's writings that I think give a lot of wisdom about how we might do things better. And the Tibetan system and of justice prior to Chinese occupation, and a ton of different aspects of the Vinaya that have become the basis of some past and some to some degree present Buddhist countries. can tell us a lot about how we could do things better here. Said the US continuing to export our criminal legal system to the rest of the world. I'm like, what about if we look at some Buddhist writings and thinkings on this, and indigenous people stuff too, is primarily, and Mennonite people's thinking. It's what the Mennonite people call the covenant justice. So there's lots of different cultural roots of thinking about how do we do this. Lauren, I had a question if I could jump in here and thinking about some of the people, since I laid that groundwork, I do work with lots of folks who have had direct dialogues with the people who've even like killed their children. So I facilitate these dialogues between people, right? And one of the things that we've noticed, many of us have forgiven what would be seemingly unforgivable acts. There's no more rumination. There's no more wishing harm, right? About the worst stuff. And then when someone cuts us off in traffic, I literally have seen some of the people who like served 27 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, and it got turned up that the DA purposefully hid the evidence and do. And they like will hug that DA today, right? They've like come all the way there. But then somebody cuts them off in traffic and they're like, gonna try to get in front, like literally trying to move the car so we joke and like trying to be like, have some analysis of that, be like, do you think you're really just still mad at the warden? Or are you, I mean, I'm asking you to put on your psychologist hat here, you know, those of us who, these like little quotidian insults still get under our skin. And so my eyes are getting like ugly like that, right? Like, and at the same time, even when we've let go of the big things, when I look at my heart, I think that there's like one particular big thing that's like, I could be angry for the rest of my life about, that I'm just not, like it's gone. It's interesting. And I've been thinking about the challenge of this. It's almost like the more subtle things or the smaller things are still strike the ego in some way that's harder to root out. I don't know. Maybe it's just because like the big harms are ones that you can apply loving kindness to. You can do the just like me meditation. You can do Tonglen for the people who've harmed you. You know, there's like so much to do with that. And then these little slights, it's like they're almost not even there. So why do they get our goat? You know, like that one sits with me. It just feels, we're like, are we forgiveness hypocrites? Like, who are we? We still carry this stuff around.
I think what an interesting observation, you know, and poignant because of the extremity of the big things that are forgiven. One quick observation I'll make, which I'm connecting like the Buddhist point here on belligerence, right? But which is pointing out the cause of harm being close. They make this differentiation of, right, the cause of harm being close by is the phrase they use there. And I just want to connect that I'm just gonna make up a theory for a second. You asked me for my psychologist hat on, so I'll do that for a second, but I'm connecting it to this Buddhist point about belligerence and then some psychological research. Because one thing I would wonder about, I guess, is, actually, I'll say it this way, that like, actually, I'm going to use belligerence versus resentment. Like, that they're actually engaging two different parts of the brain is one thing that's kind of interesting in the sense of, and it's what you were getting at in a way about, like, if a harm is temporally distant, you can use your neocortex to sort of contemplate, you know, to sort of develop empathy, to develop patience, to develop a sense of, you know, they wanted to be happy, you know, this person wants to be happy too, and whatever, there are all kinds of like sort of logical and analytical processes that one can engage in that can allow one to come to a place of emotional forgiveness. But I'll use your example, like the example you were giving of somebody cutting you off on the road. It's actually, I mean, on the one hand, we can cultivate patience with that, but it's actually a different part of the brain, if you think about it. It's in the moment, going back to the point about the difference between resentment, because resentment is where the person's far away, right? And you're sort of ruminating, versus belligerence, they're close by. And one point I'm just adding in here is when the object is close by, there's a sense of immediate threat. It's that part of your brain that gets engaged. It's that part of your nervous system that gets engaged. And so it's actually a different work in a way. Like the work we do on the temporally distant forgiveness is, I think I would say, I mean, is from a Buddhist perspective, it's more connected to belligerence, but it's also neurologically it's a different work in a way. And one can do it, one can change that, but it's different. The logical sort of analyses, if one is relying on those and then you're out driving and somebody, there's this immediate sense of threat that comes up that gets a different kind of physiological reaction going. And that more cognitive and imagery based stuff is good, but it's not, you can do that when you get home, but you can't do that while you're driving very easily. So I actually think it would be a different kind of work in a way. So I would argue that the same principles apply, but I think it's actually that it's the proximity gives rise to the immediate danger, which is a kind of fight and flight in the moment response. Yeah. So I just think, so if you're going to work with that, I think it actually has to be a different kind of work.
Yeah, that is really helpful. Thank you, Lauren. And as I'm just looking within myself, I'm seeing that's my growth area, right? It's like when stuff's in my face, my reaction cannot be, even if I have a minute to get out of the limbic brain and into the prefrontal cortex, right? My son came home in the middle of a burglary, and he's fine. A few years ago, he was actually held at gunpoint while they robbed everything. And I came home after the people had left, and I was never, I've been practicing forgiveness is like my life's work. So I was practicing it just from the time of getting to the office to home. By the time I was engaged with my son, I've never been angry at the people who did this. And it's just that little bit of gap. But if somebody is, I don't know, and it's usually people I don't know. So it's really interesting. It's like somebody I have a relationship is insulting me or harming me in some way. I also don't get angry very often. But if it's like the people who won't use their left turn signals while we're both waiting at a light, those people, I really want to hurt them. And it's just a bizarre thing that's the thing that sends me. It's like this affront that you will not use your left turn signal so that we can both make it through. Why is that thing that causes, and it sticks for many minutes. It ruins a part of my day that somebody didn't use their turn signal, which nobody does these days, by the way. Nobody uses turn signals. I don't know what happened with that. But see, and I'm blaming them, I'm already blaming people for turn signals, right? So, but this is really interesting, this distinction about the gap in time and the ability to be who do I want to be in relationship to this thing happening? And it just also ties me back to this realization about something you were saying earlier about the rumination and what we familiarize ourselves with, and the rumination. And what I see in my work in the criminal legal system is the whole system is based on hanging on to a thing for as long as that person's sentence is going to last, 10, 20, 30 years. We are continuing to see that person as if they're not changing, and to continue to harbor this systemic resentment towards this person, systemic. And then that breeds more of the same. So that the length of a thing, the distance from a thing, it's almost like it cultivates the continuation of a thing, even when it's at a distance, is what feels really dangerous to me. I don't know, that just got me thinking about a lot of stuff. So thank you, it's really helpful.
Well, one quick comment I'll make just from what you said is, so that, and one other observation is, with the example of the left turn signal, example, you can't, I find that, as I say, right, one has to work with that in advance. The other ones are after the fact. You do the reason, right? You can work on forgiveness after the fact. Whereas if it's your example of left turn, so you don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know when, but one would have to work on it in advance through imagery, actually. So imagining yourself in the situation, and then, and bring up the tiniest bit of the reaction, and then practicing, and then again, imagine yourself on different roads, and retraining your limbic system, actually. It would be like a retraining of the limbic response through imagery. I think that's the main way to do it. And then actually, I've done that kind of thing. And actually, it's funny if you do it, if I do it sitting alone in a room for a while, then I can get excited, like, oh wow, I want to go drive in a place where nobody ever does the left turn signal, because I'm going to get to practice my loving kindness meditation in vivo now. You know, it's like once I've done it in my room enough, then like I'll go, you know, you can be excited to go drive on some road where there's a lot of traffic and a lot of left turns and go in circle, you know, because it's like, oh, this is my meditation for today. But you'd first have to, in my experience, I'd first have to do it alone. And then I could be excited to go like do an in vivo practice session of loving kindness meditation with left turns or something. But that's retraining. That's actually a retraining of the limbic system, if you think about it that way. So, yeah. Oh, you're muted.
That's beautiful. I have the spot. It happens every day when I drive my child to school. It's
Oh,
always.
so you're easy. So you have an easy practice.
I've got a daily practice now, so thank you.
Lynn. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this may be really old research, like 15 years ago, okay, but there was a doctor who had done research up at Harvard on meditation and how it affects us. And she said their findings, now this is old, okay, were that if you do meditation regularly, you don't have that fight or flight response to things that aren't really dangerous, like the left turn signal, that you will actually train your system not to have that reaction to the left turn signal, or, you know, I'm just using that as an example, but you still maintain the ability to react to real danger. In other words, your adrenaline doesn't actually, there's a carryover effect from the meditation. So you don't react to the left turn signal if you do meditation regularly. This was what her research showed, and may have been, you know, she didn't talk about two different parts of the brain, but she said that you basically changed the flight or fight response in a way that you didn't react like that to things that weren't really harmful. And that, you know, part of our problem in the modern world is we have lots of experiences where we act in that way to things that aren't really dangerous, like the left turn signal. They're irritating and you get upset about it, but they're not really threatening our safety. And so what she said at that time, and it was a while ago, was the research showed that if you meditate regularly, you dull that reaction so that your adrenaline system, I mean, physiologically, your adrenaline system does not react to things that aren't going to truly harm you in the same way that it would for someone who doesn't meditate, and that it still is able to protect you in cases of real danger. In other words, your adrenaline will kick in if there is, you know, somebody that wants to harm you or your kid or whatever, you know. So I don't know. I always thought that was the same part of the brain, and the meditation sort of killed that instinct to get really angry at the left turn signal. Not killed it, but dulled it.
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that research, but that's intriguing. I assume she was using mindfulness of breathing. I mean, there are also different kinds of meditation, but I assume she's talking about mindfulness of breathing.
Right.
That's interesting.
I mean, I don't think it was, you know, I don't think it was Buddhist theory, right? But I thought it was still very useful in terms of dulling that immediate reaction that we all have.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. Oh, and Larry.
Hi, this has really been interesting. It's I was following it along from your text perspective for a moment, and then the discussion that's come about the politics and society and all that is affected, or I don't know if affected is the right word or not, but that exist, and how does that incarceration, our behavior, all of that come about? How does it affect, so much? And basically, I was just going to thank you for that conversation, because I've begun a new book project, and own just war theory. And I forget which one was talking about, our government and its behavior towards people for various behavior and how that comes about. And that's a big discussion about, this country's always at war. We've been in war almost entirely since World War II without actually declaring it. And it caused me to think, I was approaching it from a philosophical perspective and a legal perspective on why do we do that? How do we get away with it? And how do we justify it? I'm taking the position there is no justification. And there's, of course, argument there, but the argument or the discussion that's been taking place is that at an individual level, but I'm wondering how that can be extended to look at various size groups. Because when we're talking about going to war, it's not just one person deciding it. We can't even get a Congress or a president or anyone else to do it legally anymore. They just approve a budget and then off everybody goes with a bunch of generals going nuts. Can't wait to get their next I've been there ribbon and, get into a country that we have no business at legally. So it all comes back to your discussion in the context of today and how we expand it to affect not only individuals incarcerated, but on a much larger scale. I'm not asking for a solution to it. You'll run my book and I won't sell anything if you do. But it is a great discussion. I appreciate that from all of you doing that. So,
Well, thanks. Those are interesting reflections too. Lynn, yeah, do you have a comment?
I thought, I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Hedges' book, War is the Greatest Evil, but what he draws is very Buddhist, I think, is that, he's a doctor in divinity, I believe. But what he draws is this connection between the peace that was made after the Second World War is what led to the current war in Ukraine, that basically the Russians were promised certain things and the West went back on them, and that built up resentment, anger, whatever in the Russians, and they go into Ukraine because they say NATO's not keeping its part of the bargain. Whatever the facts on the ground is, the world is in this horrible war, but the roots of that war came out of the peace for the Second World War. So it's very much like the war is all evil and the causes are from another war. And so it just leads to perpetual war.
if I could go back on that thought, though, it's there is a higher level that affects nations, and drilling back down to individual governments, individual players that perpetuate this. But in the context of what we're talking about today, it calls me to think as individuals that we could, in fact, regardless of justice or whatever, in a society, individually, we can make decisions on how we view that type of violence at whatever level. And if we expand that out to, I don't know, local, state, federal level, and how we can have an influence on that. I don't think there are enough Buddhists right now to vote and say no more. We're going to do it this way. And if there were, it would be interesting to see how a government would respond to that. As we saw in Tibet, China didn't respond very well to it at all. So I don't know. I'm not trying to answer it or asking you for answers, because it's a very complicated question. But it does make me think about, first off, where am I at and what can I do individually, and then how can I write about this in such a way in war and going to war so that others can think about it, not give them answers, because I don't have the answers and probably never will. But I think that's part of the problem. We don't generally think about it. We just accept that I got to go to war, and do we? And I'm not seeing that justification. So thanks for your comment. That was very helpful.
On one, I know we'll continue on with the text, but I just want to say one quick comment, which is with all the mental afflictions, and so far we covered two related to anger. Like, well, obviously, I started by saying they're studying these are tools for introspection, and what influence, what influence we have in any given situation, of course, I don't know, but I do think one small point is, it's hard work, isn't it? Like to recognize what's going on in my mind, honestly, right? To actually honestly, and then there'll come one about speech, but how does my speech, how do my nonverbal communication, how am I participating? In other words, because what you guys are getting at in a way is also, whether it's Sujata's point about the prison system, I guess, and or the later point Larry was making about wars, is how do we all, what I guess on any societal level, how do we participate in a society, and what are we bringing to that is one point. And at least one thing we can do, I guess I'll say this, I don't know what I'm no expert, so I don't know what we can control outside of ourselves, but one thing we can control is, am I coming at it with a mental affliction in my mind, with an awareness that if we are, we'll make it worse. That's the Buddhist perspective, right? If you come at it, the question or the situation, from a perspective of with a mental affliction motivating that moment, then you're contributing negatively to the situation. Whereas if you come at it without a mental affliction in your mind, with a state of love in your mind or compassion or some other not faith or one of the virtuous mental factors, then that's one contribution we can make. But beyond that, you guys know better than I do some of the more broad questions of society. But yeah, this time, so we'll cover at least one or two more. Next one is concealment, is the way it's translated here. Art Engel, who's a good translator, translated this one as dissembling, so different translations. And this one, as they'll say, is connected to it's a secondary mental affliction connected to the root mental affliction of ignorance. So it says here, regarding concealment, the Compendium of Knowledge, the Abhidharma says, what is concealment? And it answers, it is the hiding of misdeeds, so one translator says, or faults, when one is justly accused, or I could say they're justly pointed out, and it is involved with ignorance, as we said. It has the function of acting as a support for not abiding in contact with regret. And I'll just read the next part. So it says, just as has been said above, it is an awareness or a mind, right, that wishes to hide one's own faults through the force of ignorance, when another person, such as a spiritual guide, benignly points out one's faults. Refusing to accept one's own faults, this concealment causes even small faults to greatly increase. It serves as a cause of not abiding in contact with regret for one's faults, and for not abiding in contact with happiness, and has the function of impelling one to the lower rebirths in future lives. So you get the idea here. I just want to point it right. So this one, which they're calling concealment or dissembling, right, it's basically a dishonest, it's a wanting to hide one's faults. And it's particularly in a, so it's an impulse in the mind, though, right? This is a mental impulse. So it's a mental impulse to sort of where one is, and I want to point out, like, there's what's there to say, right? Yeah. So anyway, I'll start with this. So you want to hide them, in order to look better, right? In order not to look bad, right? And what it's pointing out, it's actually interesting. They're saying here, it's in the context where somebody else is pointing out your faults, right? And you try to hide them. And is that there's actually, I just want to, pausing for a second, there's a basic assumption behind this, a Buddhist assumption, which is implicit, I think, so I just want to make it explicit, which is that it's really helpful to honestly see your faults, right? And then to regret them. And to regret, you try to correct them, right? You take some action to try to regret them. That's an assumption that's here, right? In Buddhist psychology, that is kind of taught in Buddhist psychology, actually. And it's actually interesting, isn't it? Like, I don't know what your guys' experience is. Like, actually, like, I have a lot of, I'll be honest, I have a lot of faults, but one thing I don't understand oftentimes, and it takes me effort to understand it, in other words, is when people mind having their faults pointed out to them. Like, because I have a lot of faults, but I don't mind usually. My experience is usually happy if somebody points out to me that I did something wrong. Not always, I guess. But it seems useful, right? Like, in other words, how do you notice your faults unless somebody helps you see them, you know? And so here what it's getting at is that, like, when somebody else points out your faults, I mean, their motivation can be good or bad. Here they're assuming, they give the example of a spiritual God who's doing a kindness. But the point is that it's something to go think about, right? It's something to go reflect on. You know, now sometimes people can be wrong. They can point out a fault and you can go check and say, well, actually they were mistaken. It wasn't, you know, they were just angry and they saw something wrongly or something. You know, and so sometimes people who are pointing out your faults can be mistaken in what they're seeing. But this is getting at, you know, sort of basic Buddhist assumption, which is that it's not, one is that there's a use in seeing one's own faults. Another is that concealing them is not useful. That it's helpful actually to kind of say, yeah, these are my faults, you know, and there's also, I just want to point out another thing here, which is Buddhism also has a certain assumption there, which I just want to point out because we don't always have it, I think, in this individuals, which is your faults are not permanent and they're not in the nature of your mind. So I guess my point then is, like, I think sometimes what I've noticed, because I struggle sometimes to understand this point, is I think sometimes when people have a trouble with concealment, it's like they have a feeling that, well, one is they could be trying to, like, sell a certain image, obviously, or something, you know, hold on to a certain image of yourself, but also there's some kind of idea, I think sometimes, which I guess Sujata was sort of getting at from a legal justice perspective, but I think beyond just on a very simplistic level, we all have it in society sometimes, I'm afraid, or many of us do, which is this idea that your faults define you, or your faults are permanent, or your faults are always part of you. And the Buddhist assumption actually is very different, isn't it? The Buddhist assumption is that, like, the most enlightened person in the world was a mass murderer in a past life. We all were, is part of the point. You know, so it's a basic Buddhist assumption that we've all had every fault, right? The Buddhist assumption is, like, that in some past life, I was a dictator, whatever, we all were. In other words, we've been in infinite past lives. So there's a basic Buddhist assumption that we've all had faults, had every kind of fault. The Buddha also had faults and, you know, corrected them. And then the Buddha became a Buddha by correcting his faults over lifetimes until he became a Buddha. So there's this idea, I guess I'm just pointing out, that, like, faults are not such a big deal. They're not something to be, sometimes we translated shame, and what, you know, translators of Buddhist texts translate shame different ways. And sometimes they translate shame as a positive mental state, but there's a kind of global shame, as if I'm terrible. You know, I did this fault, so now I did some faulty action, so I'm terrible or something. Buddhism says Buddhism would say that's, like, kind of ridiculous or something. You know, in other words, to regret a fault is good, but then you move on because it's not in the nature of your mind. It's not in the nature of who you are. You're like everybody else. You have faults. So you have them point out and you correct them and you become better, you know, you become a better practitioner, a better at love, better at kindness, better at wisdom, whatever. So I'm just pointing out those are assumptions, I think, behind this, that when somebody points out your fault, I noticed that, actually, I'll just say last comment. I noticed that with, it was funny, like, I'm just pointing out a cultural difference. Like, I noticed that when I would hang out with Tibetans, that they would be like, whether it was like, actually, the first way I noticed it was Tibetans would say to each other or to me or to whoever, you know, oh, you're fatter than the last time I saw you or something, you know. And it wasn't it was just like, and then it was not, what's the way to say, right? Or, oh, you're, you know, or they would point out, like, you know, somebody, their character was a certain way. And I was like, oh, wow, there's no animosity. It's just like an observation, you know, it's like, you know, you'd be like, yeah, you know, whatever. Same, and it had no more moral judgment than, oh, you're thinner than last time I saw you. Whereas in America, one's an insult and the other is a compliment, usually. And I was like, oh, they both are just observations. Neither was a compliment and neither was an insult. But my point is like the same applies for mental states, you know. So, like, because when a Lama points out, you know, oh, you're being more patient, or oh, you're being angry, there are observations for you to work with, if that makes sense, you know, is the idea. So anyway, those are all assumptions, I think, behind this, but the idea is the mental state of wanting to conceal your faults is a mental affliction. And then Sujata has a comment.
Yeah, I have a quick comment and then a question about what things are connected to with regard to the secondary afflictions versus the more primary ones. The comment was just one of the things I really love about one of my primary teachers in the justice realm are Indigenous people. And in Indigenous languages, they don't have very many nouns at all. Almost everything is a verb. And so, for example, instead of saying there's a woman sitting over there, they'd say womaning is happening over there. So everything is in a constant state of change. So I can't remember the language, it's Anishinaabe. Anyway, instead of the word or the noun a bay, like a body of water that's a bay, it is to be a bay. Wikwegama means to be a bay. And so because implicit in this understanding, the way the language works is that because it's going to be a stream and it's going to be mist and it's going to be a river. So there's like literally nothing fixed. And so the word for offender in Diné, Navajo, is acting as if one has no relations, like this notion of all my relations, like we're in interdependence at all times. And so when you transgress our collective values about how to get down in the world, right, we are acting as if we have no relations, we are out of consort with. So forgetting his first name, Bohm, was the Dalai Lama's first like science teacher person around quantum mechanics. And he was trying to create a language to understand, he felt like the difference between I think Newtonian and quantum mechanics, the problem with not being able to come up with the grand unifying theory is that we didn't have the language for it. And then it needed to be a verb-based language. So he's trying to come up with this language called the Ria mode, a scientific language that only operated in verbs. And somebody introduced him to the Blackfoot Indians who were like, why are you going to make that language? We already have that language. You know? Yeah. So I just thought that was a really beautiful thing to think like about, like, what would it look like if we stopped calling ourselves nouns? They're so out of consort. I recently gave a talk for a statewide conference for the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. And I said, why are you calling people the thing that you want them to stop doing? Like, that's like, stop doing that. Like, that's not, if you want it to stop, like, don't leave them fixed in time there, right? So that was my comment. And then my question is around concealment. So are these all connected? Is the primary thing that they are sort of connected to either anger, attachment, or ignorance, or can they be, are some of these going to be connected to some of the other principal afflictions? Because to my mind, concealment has a lot more to do with pride. Like when I'm concealing, I mean, everything feels like it's connected to ignorance. All of them are caused by ignorance, right? So I'm curious why they make concealment attached to ignorance instead of, to me, what I'm noticing, like if I take a moment to be like, I didn't do that when I did, or when I feel a sense of like, I mean, it's like refusing to accept one's fault. Is it because I literally cannot even see my fault? That's how deluded I am? Or is it that if I look a little deeper, there's something a little like, that's not me. I don't talk too much, or whatever it is that I actually do. That's more pride-based, if that makes sense.
I've had the same question in the sense that I mean, oftentimes I think this one, I mean, seems connected experientially for people to pride. So I've had the same observation. I guess the way I think about it, which I'm not sure, I mean, I haven't seen a direct commentary on this point, but the way I think about it, because it says here also, it's, what does it say here? There's a phrase, I'll find the actual phrase here. It says, it has the function of acting as a support for not abiding in contact with regret. So because it says that, you know, the way I've thought of it is that, is more like, yeah, so I mean, I assume that to me that implies, I guess, although I'm not sure, that the connection to ignorance is what you were implying, which is the sort of, that it's a not seeing and a refusing to see, or refusing to, you know, that then keeps one ignorant in the sense that, because regret is a kind of intelligence, actually, or a kind of wisdom, understanding right from wrong in relation to oneself. So that's how I think of it, is that the connection to ignorance is a kind of not wanting to, not being willing, I guess, to tolerate an awareness of a fault in order to then regret it and move on, and sort of improve. But I've had the same observation about it. So I think it can also, I personally think it can connect to pride. But I think that the concept of regret here is somehow, and also all of these, one other point is, as we go through, you'll see all of them connect just to those three for some, even though there are 6 root mental afflictions. When they make them derivative, they make them derivative of the 3, and sometimes a combination of 2, like attachment and ignorance both. But they don't have, they don't list some that are secondary to the other 3 root mental afflictions. So they're all going to be categorized that way. So it may be that, if I were doing it, I would say ignorance and pride, but they don't do that. They don't list them that way for whatever reason. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, or ignorance and attachment to my own notions of self or whatever, or to my reputation, even if we're only going to use the 3 big guys, right? Like that.
Yeah, I would list it that way for me, but but Vasubandhu knew better than I do. So.
Makes me wonder, like, what am I missing if it's just ignorance? So thank you.
And by the way, and I loved your point about language. That was fascinating.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. David Baum is the scientist, and there's a film out there if you want to watch about his relationship to Krishnamurti and then how that led him to the Dalai Lama and his work in quantum mechanics and its relationship to his relationship to the Dalai Lama. It's really beautiful. BOHM.
Interesting. And then Lynn, did you have a comment or something or a question?
It's sort of about the connection between the 3 we've gone through, belligerence, resentment, now concealment. I don't know if the intention is to have them be connected, but it does seem like all of them are connected to distortion. That's where I think you get the ignorance. The concealment is a distortion of what's going on. So the concealment is not seeing things the way they are.
Yep.
Not seeing your own faults, in other words. So it seems like there's a connection between the 3.
I agree, and actually I'll make 2 quick comments. One is actually just one point they make is that all the mental afflictions are distorted is one point. So all the 6 primary and the 20 secondary, all of those mental afflictions are connected to distortions of reality is one point. So you're right in that. Another point I just want to reinforce that you're correct about, that I didn't say, but it's true actually. Different lamas have pointed this out, that all 26 of these mental afflictions, if you can put them all together, also are interconnected with each other. In other words, that to the extent that you, I don't know how to say it this right way, that they all play a role or can play a role in supporting the other. So like, the traditional example is the more attached a person is, the easier it is for them to get angry, right? If you're very attached to your stuff and then somebody harms your stuff, then you get angry at the person. Or if you're very prideful and then somebody says something to, that put you down, then you become angry and so on. And so that there's a point that sometimes lamas make, I think, on a practical level and commenting on this, that in other words, that each of the, that each of these mental afflictions can reinforce others and can become a kind of self, like fuel for each other. And there's a beautiful poem that was published. It was translated into English and published a long time ago. Or I think it's a poem, but by Chandra Goman, the great Buddhist master. I think it was translated with the title "Difficult Beginnings." I found it very helpful and entertaining in a way, because what he was describing in a way was he was saying, like, he was trying to practice Dharma, but he would have a subtle mental affliction that then would lead to another, and he would be like, oh shoot, so he would like try to cultivate love, but then he would start having attachment, and then whatever, then it would the attachment would give rise to some other mental affliction, and then he would say, oh, now I caught myself with that. And he would go back and try to apply an antidote, but then because he was used to the mental afflictions, it would I guess my point though is that the antidotes become self-reinforcing once they gain power. So like love is conducive to wisdom, wisdom is conducive to compassion, and so on. But also the mental afflictions are conducive to each other. So I think your point is correct that they are interconnected and interrelated. Yeah. Okay, well, let's this time let's do another one. Spite. And so I'll just read first what he says. And yeah, so he says regarding spite, the command of knowledge is, what is spite? And then he says, it is a malicious mind that is preceded by belligerence and resentment and is involved with anger, right? So it's secondary to anger. It has the function of acting as a support for rough, violent speech to increase what is non-meritorious and not abiding in contact with happiness. So this one is particularly, it's a version of anger where you want to say something hard. In belligerence was a wish to strike out, right? It was kind of a physical, it was a kind of embodied, an anger that it was connected to the bodily expression. Spite is an anger that's connected to, so it's a mental state, but that's connected to a wish to make speech, to make angry speech, to produce angry speech. Another commentary said it's a wish to engage in hurtful, harsh speech with acrimony or animosity, right? So the feeling is animosity, or malicious mind, right? Wanting to harm. And then it's wanting to say something hurtful. So it's that wish in your mind. And a different commentary said it wishes to make others unhappy or discontented by uttering harsh words, right? So you want to say something, and actually the words can, at one point I'll make is the words can literally be harsh, like shouting or saying, curse words or something, but it can also be, it can also be something said quietly, that is going to hurt. It doesn't matter, you could say something that seems sweet that is going to hurt the person's feelings, and it's a mental state. So it's a mind. Whether you're going to say it harshly or you're going to say it, you could, like, there are ways that do it, backhanded compliments or something that make somebody feel bad. That would be, if the motivation is to make the person feel bad, if that's what's in your mind, right, is a malicious wish to make the person feel bad, then even if you give them a backhanded compliment that is going to hurt them, that's spite. That's a mental state of spite. And then it says, just as it has been said above, it is an awareness, right? So it's a mental state, which, for instance, lacking thoughts of regret and admission when another person points out one's faults, wishes to utter harsh speech out of hateful thoughts driven by belligerence and resentment, right? And so you get the idea, right? They're giving an example. So if somebody criticizes you, and then you feel angry and you want to criticize them back. So they may, they criticize you, you feel bad, and then you want to say something mean back to make them feel bad. That's an example of spite. And then it says, regarding this, Vasubandhu's discussion of the fire, it says it's actually it's a wish to hurt through rough words, you could say. It's because it's a mental state. Explaining it as a refusal to let go of adhering to misdeeds. And the Precious Garland says, spite is adherence to misdeeds. Right. So, and particularly what they're getting at here is it's a kind of misdeed, right? And there's hurting others through harsh speech is a negative karmic action, right? And spite is the motivation that wants to do it. And then he again quotes Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Koshavasya, the self-commentary to the Abhidharma, explains spite to be a tight holding to misdeeds. That is, it arises from a conceptual, he says here, this is interesting. He says, it arises from the conception of a bad view as supreme. Due to it, one engages in many faulty actions, such as harsh speech, and produces many non-meritorious actions. One will not abide in contact with happiness in this life, and unpleasant fruition will be produced in future lives. So he makes a number of points there, right? One is this kind of spiteful mind that wants to harm others. One point is it makes you unhappy in this life, obviously, right? If you're going around thinking about what you could, actually, we do that, don't we? Sometimes, like, you'll come up with, what's the thing I can say that would hurt the other person? Sometimes people like spend quite a lot of time figuring that out, right? And what one doesn't realize is that you're making yourself, actually, it's funny, right? If you spend a few hours coming up, people do, remember there was like that just came to my mind. There was an episode of Seinfeld like that. I just remember this, where somebody would say something mean to him, and then he would like for weeks think about what he could say back, and finally he'd come up with the perfect insult back, but of course it was too late to say it, so it was irrelevant. And then he would but his point out, so you suffer thinking about how you were put down for weeks, and then you finally come up with the insult back, but whatever. The point is that you're making yourself miserable, right? Which was what I think that humor of that episode was getting at. I remember that from years ago. So it makes you miserable in this life. It produces non-meritorious actions, which is harsh speech. But there's another point here, which I think is interesting, that Vasubandhu makes. I thought about it after I read it some, because I was like, that's interesting. He says in the quote here, it's a tight holding to misdeeds that arises from the conception of a bad view as supreme, right? What's he getting at there? And I thought about that, and I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Like, because I was thinking of like, what's the bad view behind spite? I guess I'll just ask you to think about it, right? Like, there's a bad view, holding a bad view as supreme, right, is a kind of confidence in a wrong and a bad view, not a wrong view, but a bad view, right? Remember, holding a bad view as supreme is where you have a bad view and then you think it's the best, right? You think that bad view is the best view. And actually, I could give countless examples of this, but I'll say, like, I remember this, like, I'm just remembering being a teenage boy, and I was like, I can remember, like, there's an attitude sometimes where, like, people, if you could come up with the best insult, people would be like, yeah, oh, that's not, like, it was like whoever was the best, when people were insulting each other, there'd be this, like, idea that, like, whoever was the best insulter had won and was awesome, like, oh, you're great, right? But the same thing applies, doesn't it, in, like, adult society, doesn't it? Like, oh, that nowadays that's like on I never read them, but people tell me, right? Like, if you read, like, the comment sections under political posts on some kind of I don't know, on Reddit or something, right? Like, where whoever can come up with the best sort of put down of somebody else. And so there's a bad view. I guess I was going, oh, wow, that's the bad view as supreme idea. There's where people think that the best thing you can do is to put somebody else down, right? And so, and like, that's actually a mind that cultivates spite, doesn't it? Like, so, and our society has a whole element like that, doesn't it? No, I don't know if I should say that, but anyway, I think there was one former president who encouraged that, like, that, insulting people was a virtue, and then insulting, and if you could really insult them in a way that was, like, very horrible, then that was, like, the best thing you could do. But that's spite, isn't it? So I guess my point is that spite in the moment can just be a wish to say something mean to somebody. So in the moment, sometimes it can happen very quickly, right? Somebody says something and you immediately want to lash out. But there's also, I was just fascinated by Vasubandhu's point, that you can, like, develop an idea that society does that. Actually, it was, like, horrifying to think about it, that we do that as all through society, don't we? We have these, like, streams. Not everybody does it, but there are, like, these streams of, like, thought where it's like, where the feeling is, it's really good if you can put somebody down, and even, like, if the person's like what's it called, like, the leader of another country or whatever, or from, like, at workplace or something. But anyway, it could be in small groups or large groups, but there's some idea that, like, put downs are a good thing or something, right? The ability to harm somebody with your speech is a reflection of your intelligence or something like that. There are movies like that, aren't there? Also, like, I mean, I'm just reflecting on how it's promoted in our society, like, where, like, the person says something very, sort of that devastates the other person, and that's, like, they're heroic for that or something. So that's encouraged in a way. That's the bad view of supreme, is actually that spite can just be in the moment, but there are wrong views of supreme where, like, one actually, what's the word, where groups of people cultivate spite, actually. Actually, you can see that. I was like, I thought that was so, like, so, sometimes people have, like, yard signs now, right, that are spite, aren't they? Like, where people, like, put up signs about political figures that are spiteful, like putting down somebody famous or something, like, so it's like a glorification. I guess I'm just pointing out the bad view of supreme, that sometimes there's a glorification of spite, actually. And what he's saying is, holding a bad view as supreme is particularly as a cause for lower realms, right? So, I mean, to do even spite in the moment, if somebody insults you and you lash out verbally back, that's spite, right? Having heated words with somebody back and forth. But in the socio, in the society or political or social level, if we sort of, what's the word? We can like make that a bad view as supreme, or we can say like it's good to be spiteful to our enemies. And if you can insult whoever effectively, that's a good thing. And anyway, and I don't want to pretend, and one can do that from any political perspective too, so I'm not, but it's not a good habit. It's not, and especially it's not a good thing to habituate oneself to, obviously, that's the point. And maybe I'll do one last one, which they translate here as jealousy. But actually, I personally think envy. I like, some translators use, Art Engel used envy, for example, for this one. I like envy better, although, because I think they have different connotations, but you can decide for yourself which one you like best. So he says, what is jealousy? He being Yeshi Gelson says, what is jealousy? It is a deep disturbance of the mind that cannot, and this is the word tolerate again, that cannot tolerate another's marvelous attributes due to excessive attachment to gain and honor. It is involved with hatred. It has the function of causing mental unhappiness and not abiding in contact with happiness. Just as has been said above, it is a deep disturbance of the mind that cannot bear another's success due to attachment to gain and honor. It produces serious, undesirable consequences both in this and future lives, rebirths. In this life, there will be mental unhappiness, and in future ones, one will be impelled to bad migrations. So you get the idea. One is, it's an interesting point again, right? It's like kind of funny, it was ridiculous in a sense, but we all have it. We can all become envious. But it's this idea, right? You can't tolerate another person's success, basically, right? So you see somebody else succeed, and you can't bear it. You can't bear the thought that somebody else is succeeding, right? And it says here, I guess Rabdin said, it's unable to bear the good things that others have, and it brings mental turmoil, right? So it could be that the good things people have externally, like their wealth or their home or their car, it could be, or their partner, I guess, or whatever, or it could be good things people have internally, their wisdom or their learning or their peace of mind or their whatever. Vasubandhu says in one commentary, its function, the action of envy, is to cause oneself to become rejected and dejected rather, and to remain discontented. And he points out it can be over gain or honor or fame or family or lineage or race or morality or learning. It could be over anything. You can pick anything and then be jealous of somebody else over it. And one point I just want to make, the reason why I was differentiating jealousy from envy, I don't know how you take the connotation of the words, but it's connected to hatred or anger, right? And I just want to point out a differentiation here, that it's not covetousness. That's a different. The covetousness would be connected to attachment, right? So there's one, and I sometimes think jealousy to me implies covetousness. Like, so there are two different. I just want to point out there are two different mental states, and they're not the same. I just wanted to mention this. One is where you want to have what the other person has, right? Like, so you see somebody with a nice home or something, right, or whatever, and you feel, oh, I want to have what they have, right? And so that's like coveting it. Or I think of that. The word jealousy in English for me has that connotation. I don't know if it does for you, but like, so there's one mind that where you want to have what the other person has, and so you're kind of wishing for it, or I think of that as jealous. The reason why I think of this one as envy is there's a quality of anger and not being able to bear it. Like you wish you could, and that there's a quality of like where you want what they have, but you also want to destroy what they have in a way. You wish they couldn't have it. That you should have it, not them. Does that make sense? So there's a difference between, I would say there's a difference between well, there clearly is a difference between just wanting to have what somebody else has, which is a non-virtuous state, and this non-virtue, which is actually a kind of anger, right? That you can't tolerate, so you get angry that the person has it. Like you want to have it and you're angry they have it instead of you, right? And you actually wish you could kind of, you wish you could have it, but you also, there's a quality of anger here, or hatred, where you wish you could, that they wouldn't have it, that they would have less than you, not more. Does that make sense? So that's what connects this one to anger. and makes it quite disturbed. And another point I wanted to make, last thing I'll say, and then if there are comments, but I wanted to point this out too, that this mind is the opposite of rejoicing, and rejoicing is the antidote to this, right? So in Buddhist practice, and that's where I think it's funny in a way, right? Because when you look at this, jealousy or envy, I'm going to call it envy. Envy deeply disturbs your mind, right? Because you feel, what's the word, as it says, right? You feel mental turmoil, you feel kind of anger that they have it, and anger that you don't have it, right? Whatever the thing is. And so its function is to disturb and make your mind unhappy. And so the antidote to this, the practice to do if you have a lot of envy, is to practice rejoicing, right? And rejoicing, interestingly, makes your mind happy, right? So in other words, so if you cultivate a mind that feels joy at others' successes, right? Actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Because the Buddhist perspective is, if you cultivate envy, if you let yourself cultivate envy, you feel miserable in the moment, and you create the causes to not have what the other person has, actually. So in other words, it's like, so you see somebody else having a nice, whatever thing. And then if you let your mind go to stay in envy, right, then in the short term, you're unhappy. And then karmically, you're actually directly creating the cause to not have what they have, which is what you wanted, right? And what Buddhist teachings say is, if you rejoice, then in the present moment, you're immediately happy because you're rejoicing that they have something that makes them happy. It's a sense of love, right? I want them to be happy. They have something that makes them happy. How wonderful. So it makes you happy in the short run. And as a side effect of that, Buddhist teachings say rejoicing in others' good fortune and good deeds is a karmic seed that leads you to actually succeed yourself. So jealousy or envy is quite pernicious in that way, that it makes you miserable in the present, but also blocks you from success in the future. And they say actually rejoicing in others' successes makes you happy in the short run, makes others happy because you're not treating them with envy, and creates a positive karmic tendency. One more quick point, I'll go to the comment, but one more quick point I'll make also, just because people were talking earlier about these larger scale things, is rejoicing. Also, one quick point is they also, just so we're talking about rejoicing, I want to say this too, that there's wrong rejoicing and good rejoicing. And when you watch the news, for example, there's a danger. So I just wanted to mention that. Like if you rejoice, like, so for example, if you think somebody's bad, right, and then they get harmed and you rejoice, that's wrong rejoicing, right? Healthy rejoicing is rejoicing in virtuous deeds of others or good results of others, right? So if somebody receives something they wanted that makes them happy and it's not something hurtful, it's not something bad, like, if they wanted to harm their enemy and they harm their enemy, that's not healthy rejoicing. But somebody receives, like, if somebody's lonely and they find a partner they like, or if somebody wants transportation, they get a car, you rejoice in them, that's healthy rejoicing. But wrong rejoicing would be like, people do that, where like, you don't like a certain, say people like don't like a certain people, they think, oh, this country's my enemy, and then they see the country being bombed and they rejoice. That would be a kind of evil rejoicing, actually. So don't do that. Is one point. If you're practicing rejoicing, you rejoice in the good things others receive and the good things others do, but not in something that causes suffering to others. But then Sujata has a comment.
Thanks. I know we're really close to time here, so
That's
I'll try
okay.
to keep it brief. Yeah. So I struggle with the inability to tolerate another's marvelous attributes. So sometimes we know people who have marvelous attributes, and we believe, whether rightly or wrongly, let's just say rightly, that they are utilizing them to negative ends. So they're charismatic, they're incredible public speakers or whatever. And so I'm just speaking for myself personally, like when I notice that people are getting, say, airtime that I wish I had instead or whatever, right? Because I think my cause is more noble. It's hard for me to just like, I'm thinking about the practice of rejoicing. I'm trying to practice rejoicing, like sort of disaggregating out the excellence of the qualities that they have that I lack, that I would like to have. from the negative outcomes that their positive attributes ultimately like produce, like their utilization of those negative attributes that they ultimately produce. Is this making sense?
Yeah, no, I
So-
totally get where you're going with that.
Yeah. So this is my big one. Like I will notice when somebody has airtime and they are, to my mind, both spectacular and getting it really wrong. There's a negativity that arises in me that is really like, I think it's not, maybe there's a jealousy because I want to have what they have, but there's something worse than that to my mind that feels like it falls into envy.
Mm.
And so I've been trying to do the rejoicing, but my mind gets stuck on the, but they're doing this really bad thing, right? So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just learning to manage the distinction between the wonderful qualities that they have. Like they do have these qualities that so surpass mine in these certain arenas, right? And that's why they've got the airtime. That's why they're getting what they get. I mean, I think we can think that that's true even of some of our worst political enemies that are doing terrible things. Like they had the karma to be heard. They had the karma to be elevated to that place. They have some skill sets that if you can remove what they're doing with it from, how they just show up, that they do have those things in which we could rejoice about that. I don't know, but it gets really messy to me. So when I'm dealing with that mixed bag, I don't know if rejoicing is the right approach or what it is. But it definitely feels like what I'm feeling is envy. And I know that rejoicing is the antidote, but yeah, so I think I've made my question clear.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, actually, I went to an extreme example for a second just to get, I mean, I totally get what you're getting at. And as I was sort of, I don't know, if I use somebody present, it's harder. So I went to, actually, I thought of like an obvious example. It was like, there was, in his time, Hitler was considered incredibly charismatic, right? And his speaking style was considered incredibly charismatic by millions of people. And then I think, well, actually, I couldn't possibly rejoice in that because that was not, so I don't know. I guess my own response then is like, or even like people like, I don't know, I can think of like popular culture people or something who are, they're very maybe attractive or something, whatever, I guess charismatic and attractive, but aren't doing anything, they're just sort of being famous or something. Like, whether I think of either example, my personal thought is it's best to probably just leave it in equanimity, as Buddhists would, the Buddhists. Like in other words, like if I take the example of Hitler, like, to try to rejoice in his charisma would feel kind of nauseating or something. So I would think for me, it's probably my own opinion, I guess, is it's probably better to just leave. Like if I feel somebody's doing something not virtuous with something, then to just leave it in equanimity or something is probably the best thing. Like, yeah, I would think that, and that isn't that like, that's usually what I think so. Anyway, I don't know. That's my best answer.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. It particularly relates to this, like the best put down, the slam, the ultimate cruel retort that has no response is kind of the currency these days of fame and getting your message out there in the world. And so I'm trying to get my message out there in the world, but I do not engage in that stuff at all. And it literally is directly related to Twitter followers, Facebook, and so how do we get our messages out? There's a lot of like that slam, that final put down is the currency, and I don't want to engage in it. And so but then I do notice other people have these incredibly bright minds that are really good at that particular thing.
Yeah.
And you kind of got to be impressed with the mental gymnastics, the capacity to make that sharp cutting last final put down. The other person, like who's the last person on the Twitter thread to respond? And it's literally called "you murdered them." Like when you win, you murdered them on. And then there's all the celebration about the murderer was the one who made the final last best slam in this context. And it's not, it feels not right. And this class really helped me sort it out. But I am noticing in my own mind that I have envy about the platforms that these folks have to get their messages out in the world, which I lack. And so that is, and I want to have some joy about the mind that is capable of producing the whatever it is. It's just, they have very bright minds, and they're very good at like social media and things of that nature. And at the same time, it doesn't feel right. And the Hitler example is, yeah, quite extreme. It's obvious that whatever skills he had, we don't want to rejoice in. Yeah, I just want to play with it some more, maybe dialing it back from Hitler bit by bit.
Yeah, that's why I went to the extreme.
Equanimity. I'll try to play with that. Thank you very much, Lauren.
So one other quick comment, just very brief, is like, for me also, like the example you were giving of the Twitter would be to go to the, that's why I found that interesting. I mean, that kind of thing is why I found the Vasubandhu point under spite interesting, where he says, Vasubandhu says, it arises from the conception of bad views as supreme. There is, because that there are these like, I mean, there are all kinds of like subcultures where that becomes the currency, and it's a bad view as supreme. And then I think, one can engage in that. It's like, from a Buddhist perspective, that you can't, like if there's a social interaction where the, I mean, one either take, I mean, the Buddhist perspective would either be don't engage in that, or be happy to lose in that sense, not to win. Right. That's I think the, what's it called? The 8 verses of mind training, is like where you want to lose, because to win in that, if you win in that social context, you've lost karmically or something, so I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting because it's bad view as supreme, I think. But then Wilhelmina has a comment.
Quick, tap to speak. Oh, no.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to make it quick. I've been thinking a lot about equanimity this week, and about it goes into the next thing, and miserliness and stuff like that. And what I kept from it was the Dalai Lama. We have to learn that it's not about us and they, but that's all about us. And I made a promise to myself this week that I was going to see everything in the us perspective. And that is it. That is it. So I just wanted to say that it's a shortcut. If you want to talk about equanimity, yes, that is what it is. It's not them and us, but it's us. It's all us. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, thanks. And then Lynn, last comment. Yeah.
I think the jealousy is all tied up with having a comparison of you and somebody else. So if you can take the I out of it, a little bit like what Wilhelmina was saying, it's not us and them, it's just take yourself out of it, and then it just changes your whole view on it. It's not because you're not comparing yourself to the person. And all these studies on young women who get suicidal, feel depressed because they're comparing themselves to other people on social media. It's sort of a medium that it encourages that. And so if one can pull back and not say, I'm not even participating in it, I'm not thinking of this as I. If you can take the I out of it, I think.
That's a great point. Well, I guess we went over, so we should stop, but we'll do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. It has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, which you put as enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. in order to lead all sentient beings from merely labeled, totally empty from their own sides, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Oh, and also I wanted to dedicate for our classmate Jody, that she had texted or emailed me and is having a little health problem right now, so we can dedicate for her to be well. Her and Mike, Mike's helping her out, her husband. So particularly look for Jody to heal and be well and quickly. And I wanted to thank you all. I know one quick comment. Email me if you want to do. I've been getting some emails from folks. Sometimes there are some people who follow the class and only come sometimes. There's been, I guess, Venerable Dundrup is the person who posts them to YouTube. The recordings, but he's been too busy so he's been like way behind in posting them, and then people kind of can't keep up. So if anybody is interested in taking that over from Dundrup, send me an email, and we can sort of maybe arrange that, because Dundrup can't, I don't think, keep up with it. And then some of you guys sometimes email me, or other people like Ryan, for example, who can't often make it because the kids will email and say, oh, I'm trying to keep up but can't, and then Dundrup can't keep up with posting them. So I think eventually we need somebody to take over the task of posting the recordings to YouTube. So, but and we have the more classes scheduled, so to see you guys next class.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren.
Good to see everybody.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
For sure. Good discussion there.